Coin traders, what's going on? Thanks for joining me for the show. Looking at Bitcoin BTC, want to do a quick little update. We did talk about Bitcoin a couple of videos ago, so just want to follow up specifically. Do have this big resistance line right now drawn on the screen. Now we are on the 2-day chart, so just want to talk about this big massive level of resistance. Right now we do have a price point of 71,540. So as you can see, multiple attempts on this 2-day chart testing to try to get prices above it and try to get prices to close. Most recently, we did have two candles here that actually try to test this line, get above and actually resist from that. So we have multiple attempts, and obviously now we do have a little bit of a retracement. And in this instance, we also have a little bit more of a lower low here on the shorter term, testing below the 26-period exponential moving average, but so far still making support found in between the 26 and the 50 period. So still plenty of room left to go down to test this 50 period. Not necessarily sure that we'll get there, but obviously that is still a sign and signal, especially after the last time we did backtest and confirm the 50 period as this nice support here. Now, if we do look at the bottom here and talk about some of the volumes, as you can see, after backtesting the 50, we actually had a pretty nice level of volume coming in, which shot us up to this big 71,540 resistance point. But then, unfortunately, after that, volume did start to taper off for the bulls. And even this most recent breakout from this little bit of a consolidation period here we had on Bitcoin didn't necessarily see much follow through. And obviously, we did have tapering off bullish volume, which is one of the reasons, too, that we did see rejection from this big resistance point. So now with a little bit more selling pressure coming in off of the rejection from the resistance point, we are looking to actually have the selling pressure start to get exhausted. And it does look like we're starting to get that a little bit more. Now, we do still have 1 day left on the current 2-day candle. So with volumes right now at 11.8 thousand compared to the one that closed previously, 34.5 thousand, we do expect that we're going to see a little bit of a smaller sell-off for this move. So right now we're looking at EMA support for the 50-period EMA at 64,218. So that is our lower level of support. If we actually do want to look at some levels of support for the close, we're actually looking at a couple of key ones here, specifically going to be looking at about 64,093 and 63,794. So looking left, previously big points of previous resistance as well as resistance, and also big levels of closing support, big period of support, and then also resistance as well. So very relevant levels to the chart here. And then if we do pull up VPVR, volume profile visible range, you can see that on the left, we do pull down to a mass point, 65,648. So still a little bit more support to the downside based on previous trading history as well as these exponential moving averages. So right now, not necessarily thinking that we're going to be getting a complete pullback and rejection, especially like we talked about in previous videos, that even if we didn't end up breaking this big resistance point, that would likely put us more towards a longer term consolidation pennant pattern. So even flipping here over into the weekly chart, you can see that on this bounce and pullback, still maintains support just below this 12-period EMA, but well within the gap of the 12-period to 26-period. So plenty of support opportunity. And then even right now on the current move, not necessarily even pulling back yet to test this 12-period EMA on the weekly. And like we said, we could ultimately end up seeing a tightening range and pattern, especially as we do have these EMAs start to get close and tighten before we actually have the next explosive breakout here for Bitcoin right now. So looking at 12-period EMA, price for that is going to be at 65,258. So with current prices right now at 66,788, do still have a little bit more for that room. So price percentage-wise, 2.2% to the downside. And so especially looking at resistances up overhead coming in at 69,000, 69,734. So big resistance zone up overhead, especially if we do look down at volume on this weekly chart. After hitting our peak and essentially our all-time high, did start to see a huge taper off in volume. Now, this obviously isn't just limited to bullish volume. We are starting to see tapering off in all volume, which is very indicative and a very typical pattern and setup for volume anyway. What we do see when we do see a lot more of these tightening ranges, the price does get a lot tighter as the volume does start to shrink. So the good sign and benefit that though is that typically these patterns are going to break out in the direction they entered heading into it. So for example, specifically, if we did actually want to look at the potential for a price growth here coming off of consolidation, we could potentially be looking up to just right around the $100,000 level based on the previous level. So for example, from this big move up to the current all-time high, If we do get that as being our breakout target, that would actually put prices right around the the $100,000 six-figure psychological mark. And we would expect this to be a pretty big psychological mark as well. And then even if we do get a back test, this would be extremely strong level, especially if we do see the weekly start to consolidate here for a little bit more time, which is to be expected since historically at this stage of the cycle, we don't necessarily see a lot of euphoric moves here. And we do kind of ultimately end up seeing a little bit of a cool down stage over the summer here, right before we do have the massive explosive euphoric stage of the crypto and financial cycle here. Now, one thing to note specifically about the candles on this weekly Bitcoin chart is that we do have a lot of upside wicks on this move to the upside, but we saw previously that on this pullback to the downside, we did have a lot of long lower shadows, so we do have a lot of dip buying as well, even though we also now know we have a lot of selling pressure coming off of this move too. So that does give a little bit more indication that it's probably realistic to see a few more weeks and probably even realistically a couple more months of just some sideways chop unless something pretty major or significant does come in to actually start to change and create a lot more of that buying, especially since we have had a lot of great things happening previously and yet still we are in this kind of more or less sideways stage. But just like we talked about too, we are seeing a taper off an overall decrease in weekly sell volume here as well. So we know that selling pressure is getting exhausted, which is going to be leading to a lot more of that stabilization for this opportunity. And one of the things that we would actually like to see, especially if we do get stabilization and kind of a tightening range for Bitcoin and kind of some sideways action, is that we would love to see in this instance the alts actually have their moment to see a rally, which would actually pull down the dominance if we do see Bitcoin flatline, because then that would allow the Bitcoin pairing charts to actually raise as well. And all of that would be great for actually pulling back the dominance, but we do expect the dominance to be potentially climbing here a little bit more as well. And historically, we have seen that even on some of these smaller sell-offs for Bitcoin, that does ultimately impacting a lot of the altcoins, majorly more so percentage-wise than what we see for the Bitcoin pullback. So of course, the other option right now from this point, especially after setting our low, our lower high, potentially could be pulling back and setting a higher low, even potentially kicking off this exponential moving average. One of the things about these candles that we actually need to point out is that we actually have plenty of bullish engulfing candles here, where the bodies of the bullish candles completely engulf both the previous and also follow-on candles here. Obviously, the exception right now being in the weekly candle that hasn't closed, but because it hasn't closed and printed, we can't actually talk about it as being anything to actually analyze just yet, because we are waiting for the close and the print here in about 3 days' time. So obviously the most bullish case in that instance would be if we actually saw a little bit more of that dip buying from the current, seeing prices and having this candle close bullish, breaking this resistance zone and having a big lower shadow. That would be the most bullish case, not necessarily the most probable in this instance right now. And especially on these moves, like we talked about, engulfing bullish candles, as well as bigger bullish volume here compared to the bearish selling pressure on these candles as well. But with the current week, with still 3 days left, 52,000.4 is the volume, 52.4 thousand anyway. And previous week, we did have 65. So are anticipating a little bit more volume this week compared to what we got the last couple of times. And so in that instance as well, anticipating a little bit more of that rollover and pullback, which does give a little bit more precedence and highlights the fact that this weekly pattern is starting to set up in the what we talked about, where we are starting to flatline and stabilize, especially as we allow these weeklies to catch up. Now, zooming out here, got two major trend lines. We have a support trend line here coming off of the previous cycle's lows here, where we did find support, which did make a very nice support here on this pullback. And we also have resistance points here in resistance trend line that has been coming off of the all-time highs. So essentially what we have is we have this more or less rising wedge type formation, but because we did enter and we are actually consolidating inside this zone, we could see prices still stabilize like we talked about, allow these exponential moving averages to come up. And then from there, it wouldn't be uncommon to actually see the next explosive leg here for this overall Bitcoin move and see those prices pushing up towards that 100,000 psychological mark. Now, if we actually flip over here into the logarithmic scale, you can see how we're going to be getting really tight here. And we're actually looking at an apex coming in about the middle to end of April here in 2025. Definitely no predictions to actually have us staying in this channel that long. But what we have is that with the direction entering this once again, reclaiming this level as support, it does make it a lot more likely we're going to see another continuation bullish breakout, especially like we said, direction of travel into a consolidation move like this is a lot more bullish leaning than what we had actually had previously. So we are expecting this range to get a little bit more tight, but eventually, especially given the fact that we do have exponential moving average support behind us, and with path of least resistance being to the upside, that would favor even more a nice bullish upside breakout, leading to those rise in up to that 100 psychological $1,000 mark. So no real time predictions or time frame predictions with that anyway, but just know that the longer we do progress, we are still maintaining a very nice structure on the long term inside of this longer term chart formation. And that probably one of the most bullish scenarios right now would actually be to retrace, pull back, kick off some of the supports, probably around the low $60,000 level, which would actually backtest and confirm this once again, and then finally see the next leg and break out to the upside. So even if potentially we do see that as being a target, we could be looking at another 10% or so to the downside. And that's obviously at a worst case too. If we actually look at pulling back to about the 62,000 level, we'd be looking at about 6% or so. So not necessarily that much for an overall crypto move. And again, to highlight, just like we talked about with volume actually decreasing like what we've seen, this is one of the better setups and best cases with Bitcoin, it being in this type of chart setup and pattern. And so that's why we're still speculating that in the future, especially with a little bit more patience, we will get that very nice bullish breakout. And that'll start to create a lot more of that euphoric state. Because right now it has been about 3 months that we've basically been in this overall sideways pattern so far. And it still could be another couple of months or so, but just know that as long as we do start to stay in this pattern, we do start to favor a lot more bullish upside, especially if we look previously. That's exactly the stage of the market that we're at. And we do find longer term support being right at that 12 and down to the 26 period EMAs, which is exactly what would line up if we do see this opportunity for this weekly chart to actually start to see these EMAs roll up into this overall longer term consolidation zone. So overall, like I said, I still think we could be looking at a little bit more opportunity and potential for rolling back, but as long as we do still confirm support in between the 12 and 26 and still maintain prices in this overall setup and zone, we're going to be extremely nice looking setup for a much longer term big bull break. And that will be something huge because then that would be what actually breaks out prices and sends it up to that $100,000 mark, which from current levels would actually be right around a 50% gain from current prices, which would still be a very nice move. So yeah, plenty of lower downside supports to be looking at that still maintain longer term structure and long-term bullishness, and plenty of supports from technical levels based on EMA's previous price levels, and also still maintaining longer term higher lows. But as always, do love hearing everyone's thoughts, predictions, issues, comments, questions, disagreements, all that stuff down in the comments sections below, or feel free to reach out over on Twitter. But otherwise, that is going to go ahead and wrap up the show for now, though. So thank you all for joining me for Papa Bitcoin BTC on that ticker. Hope you all enjoyed the show. If you did, please hit the thumbs up, like, and subscribe if you have not done so just yet. Do appreciate all the continuous love and support. As always, it does mean so much. That's it for now, though, so stay safe, take care, and I'll catch you back in the next video.